for those here. In says there's approximately 20 families online right now as well, so it is available. This handout is available online if you're joining us there. Just a reminder, if you have mentioned this to me earlier, if you have a longer comment, raise your hand. Ian's got a mic. He'll come bring the mic down, really for the benefit probably of our online viewership this morning. We've got a big group, which is fantastic. So, okay, so good to see you all. So we are picking up our Old Testament survey class this morning. Rick ended Wednesday night talking about the nation of Israel and the United Kingdom. Looked at several key characters there. Obviously Saul, David, Solomon. Today, guys, let's be honest, it's not going to be so rosy today. We're going to talk about the division of the kingdom, and then specifically we're going to hit the high points, talk about the northern kingdom in particular. Northern kingdom. So as Brian alluded to, Wednesday night we'll have a singing service, and then next Sunday morning, so a week from today, Lord willing, Rick will pick up and we'll talk about the southern kingdom. Not to let the cat out of the bag, I'm sure we all know. Much better outcomes for the people of Israel in the southern kingdom, but this morning we're going to tackle the northern kingdom. And one of the things that Rick had made mention of on Wednesday, I think probably can't be overstated, is that was the period of time of really Israel's golden years to a certain degree. I mean, you think about the great stuff that happened with the United Kingdom, right? So, rich history. We think of, again, Saul, David, Solomon. Obviously, there was challenges along the way, but the nation was expanded under David and Solomon. The wealth of the nation increased, specifically under Solomon. And then maybe most importantly, something was built by Solomon, right? The temple. The temple in Jerusalem was built, which God says He dwelt among His people there in the temple. So again, from a national perspective, things were really good. What we're going to talk about this morning is things are not very good. Definitely some troubles arise, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. Make sense? One of the things I was thinking about on the drive-in this morning, I didn't look this up, Rick, so check me on this, but have you thought about how long the United Kingdom lasted? It was a very short time. I want to say it's about 120 years. 120 years, roughly. We're talking, that's not very long. Not very long at all. Tensions arose, and tensions really kind of hit a boiling point following Solomon's reign. So here's my question. What do you guys remember about the splitting of the kingdom? How'd that go down? What was the ramifications? Kind of how did that manifest itself? What do you remember? Brian?
Because Solomon had a prophet, Solomon saying he tore the cloak and indicating that the 10 northern tribes would be separated from Judah and Benjamin, which Benjamin ultimately went away.
Right. That's First Kings chapter 11 specifically, where that prophecy is. Okay. What else? If you're not, I'm sorry? Yeah. Exactly. So Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So to me, Michael, that's what I think about most often. When I think about the division of the kingdom, I think about anyway, and maybe you do, maybe you don't, about the maybe poor choice that Rehoboam made. So Rehoboam was Solomon's heir, Solomon's son, right? And Rick, you talked about on Wednesday night that under Solomon there was a lot of labor involved with the people, massive projects, buildings, and things like that. And if you recall, the people came to Rehoboam and what'd they say? Let up. Give us a break, right? And so Rehoboam took counsel with two groups of individuals, right? Who were they? Okay, first, the advisors of kind of his own, call it age group, if you will, and also the advisors of his father Solomon, right? And so the advisors of Solomon said what? Hey, let the people up. They will serve you. They will be loyal to you. But advisors of his own kind of age demographic, if you will, said no, scorpions, whips, and things like that. And so to me, Michael, I don't know if that's where you're going directly specific. That's what I think about when I think about the division of the kingdom. However, Brian's 100% accurate. Look in 1 Kings chapter 11. I forget about this part, quite frankly. We're going to read a couple sections here, a little bit more than we've done in the past, but look in 1 Kings chapter 11. I'm just going to read this a little bit longer of a section here. I'm in verse 26. And again, I don't know about you, but I typically don't remember the story. 26 says, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Ephraimite of Zeradah, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zerah, a widow, also lifted up his hand against the king. Verse 27. And this is the reason why he lifted his hand up against the king. Solomon built the Milo and closed up the breach of the city of David his father. The man Jeroboam was an able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. So again, Jeroboam is a very capable individual, it seems. He's given authority from Solomon. So verse 29, and at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now Ahijah dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the open country. And Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. Brian, that's what you mentioned. Verse 31 says, and he said to Jeroboam, take for yourselves 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I'm about to tear the kingdom of the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. But ye shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me, and worship the Asherah, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chisholm, the god of Moab, Malcolm, the god of the Amorites, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my rules, as their father David did also. Verse 34, nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose, who kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and will give it to you, 10 tribes. Yet to his son I will give one tribe, that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen to put my name. Verse 37, I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you, and will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. And I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. I don't always remember that story specifically. Again, I generally think about, again, the Rehoboam, poor decisions, listen to the wrong advisors, but let's remember, guys, God's at work here. And God had said because of the failures, the kingdom was going to be split away. And so, reading it for the first time, Jeroboam's in a great position here, a very good position. One, he was a capable individual, he was probably a young man, who got things done for Solomon. As a result, Solomon put him in charge of the forced labor. But then God gives Jeroboam a promise, right? If you will follow my ways, I will make you a sure house, as my father David did. And so that's why we read that Jeroboam's down in Egypt. Solomon knows about this prophecy, if you will. And so he wants to kill Jeroboam, and that's why Jeroboam flees down to Egypt until the death of Solomon. Does that make sense? Okay. So, from a Jeroboam's perspective, he's in a good spot. So what do we remember? What happens to Jeroboam? What does he do? Does he follow the Lord God and have this sure house that God had promised him? Absolutely not. Nothing could be probably further from the truth. Started out with great potential, great promise, yet made some very poor decisions. I would argue one of his big decisions at the kind of the onset of his reign really set the people up in a negative way, and quite frankly, I don't think they ever recovered as a result of it. Do you remember what he did? Okay. Yep. Huge deal. So, from a political sense, right? So, where were the people to go to worship? Jerusalem. Why? Because the shiny new temple was there, right? That Solomon built. And where is Jerusalem? Judah, southern kingdom. So politically, if you're king, if I'm king, if you're queen, do you want your people going down to Judah to worship God as they've been instructed to do? From probably a political sense, that probably poses some challenges. And so Jeroboam thought, again, hey, if they do that, why do they need me? They probably don't need me. And so the concern Jeroboam had was, hey, they're going to go back to Rehoboam, who, by the way, is Solomon's heir, Solomon's son. And so they will leave me, get rid of me, don't need me, and so forth. So he did something. Brian, you alluded to it. He set up 2 new places to worship, I should say. 2 new places to worship. Anybody remember where they were at? Very good, very good. Dan and Bethel. In fact, I'm in chapter 12 now. Look in verse 28. Does this sound familiar? So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he said, one in Bethel and one in Dan. Bethel being the southern part of the northern kingdom, Dan being the very, very upper part of the northern kingdom. So again, poor decision on Jeroboam's part. The Lord God had given instructions on how to worship. Jeroboam takes it upon himself and says, behold, these 2 golden images, these are your gods that brought you up in the land of Egypt. And now, guess what? I'll just make it more convenient for you. Just go to Dan. Just go to Bethel. You don't have to go down to Jerusalem to worship as the Lord God had commanded you. Does that make sense? I mean, this is such promise, such potential of Jeroboam. And yet, what do? You squander it. You squander it and do this thing which was against God's commands. What happened to Jeroboam? Anybody remember? So let's look in chapter 14. I'm in verse 10. The same prophet, Ahijah, verse 10 says, I will bring harm upon the house of Jeroboam and will cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and will burn up the house of Jeroboam as man burns up dung until it's all gone. Anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone who dies in the open country, the birds of the heavens shall eat, for the Lord has spoken it. So the prophet Ahijah, who earlier prophesied Jeroboam's rise to power, now says dogs, vultures are going to eat the king and his family. Jeroboam's son, after him, reigned 2 years and then was assassinated in a coup. So again, I guess what I'm trying to do is paint the picture. The beginning of this divided kingdom, the northern kingdom specifically, got started off in a very, very bad way with Jeroboam. And again, I think we probably all surmise that they never recovered as a result of it specifically. Any thoughts about that before we move on? Okay. We're going to go through a bunch of kings down in the northern kingdom. So question, how should we define whether a king was good or evil? Now, the easy answer is, some kings, the answer is given to us. This person did evil in the sight of the Lord. Other kings, it's not mentioned. So, what are some criteria we should use to determine if this king, this ruler, was a good ruler or a poor one? What do you think, Ryan? Idolatry. So, make sure they themselves weren't worshipers of idols. Okay, Michael? If they were faithful to the covenant, I think. Yes, no, 100% agree. Are they faithful to God's covenant made to Abraham, reaffirmed at Mount Sinai in God's law? Are they covenant faithfulness, I think, as well? Yeah. I put another one on here, too. So, Brian, I put, 1, did the king worship God alone? I think was your point. 2, also probably your point, did they rid Israel of idolatry? Okay, not only did they serve God, but did they rid Israel of idolatry? And then 3rd, Michael, to your point, I put, were they faithful to the covenant relationship of God's people? So, again, those are 3 possibilities you might use, but think about that as we go through and talk through some of these kings, if you will. do these three things hold up? So, we're not going to read everything, but let's just do just kind of a general quiz here. You may remember, how many kings were there in the northern kingdom? How many kings? How many kings reigned in the northern kingdom? More than 5, less than 50. It's about 20, 19 or 20, depending upon the names and whatnot. Here we go. Based on the criteria we just talked about, how many of the kings, do you remember, how many were good? A fat 0. 0. None of them adhered to God's covenant relationship with his people. Idolatry was a big one. Here's a question. How many of them were assassinated, do you think? 7 of them. 7 of them were assassinated. One of them committed suicide. How many family dynasties were there, you think? Well done, Brian. It's 5. 5, depending upon how you count. In some of these, you could probably make an argument a couple different ways. There was also 3 different periods of time that there was not a dynasty at all. So someone was made king, that person was killed or assassinated, and then a new family, if you will, started ruling and whatnot. So 3 periods of time there was no. So my point is, guys, this is going to, not to give the, let the cat out of the bag, this is going to be complete opposite of what we see in the southern kingdom, where the longevity, yes, they had some poor kings and queens for that matter, but they had good ones at the same time, and it was a dynasty in that sense. So again, turmoil, uncertainty, assassinations. I mean, this is like movie type stuff that we see in the northern kingdom. Very, very sad point of Israel's history. Okay, so what I want us to do is talk through a little more. I got 3 examples. 3 examples of rulers in the northern kingdom that I think will help give us a feel for what was it like culturally to be an Israelite living in the northern kingdom. So 3 individuals, 3 rulers we'll talk about just briefly, but also we're introduced to kind of a new, character is the wrong word, but we're introduced to a new term, I guess, of a prophet. We talked about Samuel briefly, but specifically in the northern kingdom, prophets become something that is risen up by God. So we'll talk about what a prophet is and a few examples of those. Does that make sense? Okay. First king I think we ought to talk about just briefly here, we'll just run through this quickly, is Omri. Anybody remember anything about Omri? It's somewhat obscured. I get that of the 19 I've listed here. Anybody remember anything about Omri? I'm sorry? He was bad. Okay, well, that was set myself up. Thank you for my wife. Yeah. He was bad. Yes, he was bad. So Omri was an Israelite commander in the army, and the Israelite king before him was killed, was assassinated, and Omri's men and all of Israel, it says, made him king that very day. So he was not son of someone, son of ruler, son of king. No, he was an Israelite commander. And this was in 1 Kings chapter 16, if you need a reference point. By all accounts, he was a pretty savvy political leader who started and founded really a 40-year dynasty, which again, Northern Kingdom, that's a pretty long reign, that really whipped Israel into shape just purely from a military perspective and a political sense. From a religious point of view, yes, he was absolutely horrible. It's interesting, I think, that his beginning of being king and his demise, his dynasty's demise of being kings, all started with assassinations involving chariots. So as I mentioned before, when he became king, the Israelite king at the time was killed by an arrow while in a chariot, and that's how Omri rose to the throne, if you will. His great-grandson, actually grandson I should say, not great-grandson, his grandson in a similar way was riding in a chariot and got shot with an arrow, and that ended Omri's line as well. But here's the point, guys. 2 big things. 2 big things Omri is known for. One, he arranged the marriage of his son Ahab to a certain Phoenician princess named Jezebel, and we know those stories pretty well, I think. That's one thing that really set Israel up in a very, very poor way. The second thing he's known for, and stick with me here, is some very important archaeology. Okay, so this is a big one. I'll try not to bore you, but in 1870, there was a large stone found that had some very important biblical significance, called the Misha stone, or the Moabite stone. It was written in a form of the Phoenician dialect. It's very close to Paleo-Hebrew script, if you're interested at all in that. But here's where it gets interesting. It was the first major Canaanite inscription found in the region, ancient Moab, that's Jordan, east of the Jordan. It's the most extensive inscription ever recorded that refers to the kingdom of Israel. Specifically, it says the house of Omri. It calls out by name the house of Omri. And so what this does, this is the earliest certain extra-biblical reference to the Israelite God, Yahweh. That's a big deal in terms of historical, extra-biblical accounts. So what happens is that King Misha of Moab reports that after a long oppression by Israel's king Omri, that Moab broke free of their oppression. And so again, it's a historical evidence, if you will, of the biblical account, again, the house of Omri. And here's the best thing about it. This was found in 1870. You can see it today because it's been sitting in the Louvre since 1873. It's a really big stone. It's really cool if you get a chance to see it. It's really neat. In 2014, the king of Jordan petitioned the French government to, hey, we want it back, the ancient Moab. It was politely declined, and so it's still sitting in the Louvre today. But again, it's a big one. Again, house of Omri, referring to the Israelite God, Yahweh. Okay, Omri, not a good guy. Very, very poorly managed the country. From a religious perspective, was not a worshiper of God. I'm in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 25, says, Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did more evil than all who were before him, for he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, in the sins he made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord God to anger by their idols. Poor representation. Next two individuals, we'll chat about them just really briefly because I want to move on. Ahab and Jezebel. Several weeks ago now, I preached about them specifically. Not good individuals at all. One interesting note, it's really sad, really, with Ahab. He worshipped the gods of his wife Jezebel, Asherah, Baal. But it's interesting, it's sad that the names of his children, you guys remember this? The names of his children all have meaning signifying praise to Jehovah, praise to the God of Israel, which, again, so sad. But maybe one interpretation of that is he knew who the God of Israel was, yet for whatever reason, he chose not to follow him. He chose willingly to follow the gods of his wife, Jezebel. Very, very sad. Jezebel, again, I think we know a lot about her from all the biblical stories that even our kids learn and whatnot. Elijah on Mount Carmel, things like that. Jezebel was not a good person when it comes to from a religious perspective. Her religious doctrine was actually very simple. She was a supporter of, again, I mentioned the Asherah, the Baals, and it was very simple what she did. If you were a part of that religious ideology, you were elevated to very good positions. It was her that established this kind of maybe modern-day Congress, or maybe that's probably the wrong term to use, but she established a group of 400 prophets, 450 prophets that sat at her table that administered justice to the people. But again, these were a religious type of body, if you will. And so if you were part of that, you were elevated. If you weren't, her message was pretty simple: kill anyone who opposed that. That was the religious indoctrination, if you will, that she was a part of. And quite frankly, she was pretty good about that, because what sad words we read about that she single-handedly almost tried to wipe out the worship of Yahweh during this particular point. In fact, we read about the prophets, if you will, had to, many times in this period, had to hide themselves in caves. Hide themselves. If you were a prophet of a false god, you were eaten from the king's table, we read about. But if you were a prophet of the Lord God Jehovah, you were hiding out in caves for fear of your life, and many were put to death during this particular point in time. Another interesting kind of fun fact, religious Jews today refer to Jezebel's period right here as the First Holocaust, which I think is interesting. Talks about how bad it was during this particular point in Israel's history. Does that make sense? Any questions, thoughts about that? Religious Jews today refer to this period of Jezebel's craziness, my words, as the First Holocaust. The First Holocaust. Yes, sir. Those that call themselves religious in some manner or capacity. Yep. Again, this speaks to how bad it was for the children of Israel at this particular point in history, is really the narrative. Okay. Not good times. But what we see, though, what we see in a positive sense, I think, is a new role or responsibility, maybe is the best term, Rick, to use, I don't know. A prophet. Prophets, we see those more frequently in the northern kingdom than we did in the southern kingdom. Probably speaks to how bad things were in the northern kingdom. So here's my question. What is a prophet? Number two, how is that different than a judge? 7 days ago, we talked about judges and kind of their role. So what's a prophet? How is it different from a judge? What do you think? Okay. Okay. So from a message perspective, they were speaking on God's behalf. Okay. How's it different than a judge then? Okay. Now, great. I'll admit, I mean, there's a lot of overlap here. But it does interesting that the two different terms are used, and there are different roles and responsibilities. Dan, to your point, the judges were more kind of regional that also administered social justice, right? That's part of the responsibility of the judges. The judges also played a role from a deliverance perspective, delivering the people from whatever this regional threat was at the time. Prophet was different, though. A prophet, to Brian's point, was speaking for God on certain matters, prophesying, giving direction, things like that. So again, my point is, I want us to think about judges more from a deliverance, social perspective. Prophets, obviously, a direct, call it line of communication from God for a specific purpose. Brian, you want to elaborate on that?
The judges served sort of a leadership role, whereas the prophets did not. And if I'm not mistaken, Israel and Judah killed their prophets. Mm-hmm. They were rather humble in their positions.
Well, Jesus said, which one of the prophets did you not persecute? So no, I totally agree. It was not this elevated position in social hierarchy at all by any stretch. Whereas judges, there was times of that. In fact, what was it, Gideon? They tried to make him king during his deliverance, being a judge. Yeah, it's good observation. The two big prophets in northern Israel that we'll talk about just for a few minutes here, they both have similar names. What are their names? Elijah and Elisha, yep, however you want to pronounce it. Very, very, very similar. Very similar. Okay, so what do we remember about Elijah? What are some of the standout stories or observations we know about Elijah? Okay, he was a busy guy. I assume you're talking about 1 Kings chapter 18 on Mount Carmel. After God's demonstration of who the true God was, Elijah kills the prophets of Baal down by the brook Kishron, I believe. What else do we remember about Elijah? Okay, Michael, well done. Yeah. So what happened, Michael? Yep. In a whirlwind, right? In a whirlwind, yeah. So it was one of the few people in Scripture we read that did not die. He was taken up into heaven. Who was with him when that happened? You may remember? Elisha was there. Elisha was there. And so we have this, it's a very interesting, almost kind of like what we might call is kind of passing the torch, if you will, from a leadership role. Elijah be taken to heaven, and then Elisha is now going to be the de facto prophet, if you will, at least in kind of this section of the northern kingdom. Remember, Elisha asked for something in this episode. Do you remember what he asked for? He asked for Elijah's spirit. How much of it? Double portion, Dustin. Yeah, a double portion. That's one thing he asked for. I want a double portion, and it was given to him. One of the things that's maybe a little, I don't know, humorous but interesting. Not only do they have similar names, after Elijah was gone, what did Elisha do? Okay, they started dressing Elijah to a certain degree, right? So he put on the mantle of Elijah, put it on him, and he wore Elijah's mantle as well. Elisha did many miracles. You might remember some of the miracles he did. Maybe a little bit obscure here. Okay, he raised someone from the dead, a son who had died. He raised him from the dead, which was anytime a big deal, but we don't see that very often, specifically in the Old Testament. Yep, exactly. He fed great multitudes, not even the widow, but he fed great multitudes. He fed, had it written down here, at one point, 100 prophets with 20 loaves of bread and a sack of grain, which is another miracle. Of course, probably one of my personal favorites. If you remember, there's some young boys, right, that were giving him a hard time about his bald head, and it ended in a bear attack. I mean, come on, that's got to be number one, right? He made an axe head float. He struck an entire enemy nation with blindness. He did many, many things. He healed a certain Syrian commander of leprosy, did he not? Remember that story? Naaman, specifically? So my point is, Elijah did a lot of things, a lot of miracles were done by Elisha during this particular period of time. What did these prove? What did these show? What was the purpose behind them? Terry? Yep, that he was a man of God. Validating his words that he was speaking on behalf of God to the people. Again, same role of, well, I shouldn't say the same, but a similar role of the miracles we see in the New Testament as well. You remember something special about what happened to Elisha whenever he died? Terry, you remember it? Yeah. Well done. Well done. I'm in 2 Kings chapter 13. A very interesting story here. 2 Kings 13, verse, I think I had 20, but maybe I had that wrong. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, yes, 20. Elisha died, and they buried him. Now there were bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of that year. And as the man was being buried, behold, a band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. That's one I don't think about too often. So again, even in death, another miraculous event. This person who died, he touched the bones of Elisha, and as a result, he was risen as a result. Before we move on from those two, any thoughts about that? Both Elisha, Michael?
I was rereading 2 Kings a lot lately, just kind of my own study, and couldn't help but, again, feel like a lot of the miracles that Elisha performs are very similar to miracles Jesus performs. It's like, couldn't help but see this. It just, makes the connection, if you will, So
Yep.
Figured I'd mention that.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I mean, when you put them side by side, I don't know if you did this, but if you put them kind of side by side in a list format, it is remarkably similar. Remarkably, the raising of the dead, the feeding of people that are hungry. That's a good observation. Anybody else have anything they want to add? Very, very good. Yeah. It helps make that connection point that may be a little lost on us, but for them, that does connect things. Okay. So in summary, again, not to belabor the point, but this was a very difficult period of time for God's people in the northern kingdom. I can't help but think one of the practical applications is probably how bad leadership affects really all things, or can affect all things. The nation crumbles and sins as a direct of poor leadership. One of the things that is so scary to me, but probably to all of us, is if we think about, specifically Jeroboam, it says that he sinned and he made Israel sin. And talk about the weight of that on you and I. I don't want to be an influence to cause other people for their own sins and whatnot. So very, 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 very sad. I'm in 2 Kings chapter 17. This is kind of the summary of this kind of whole narrative we've been talking about. Verse 21 says, and when he had torn Israel from the house of David, talking about the Assyrian captivity, they made Jeroboam the son, the divided kingdom and then the Assyrian captivity. They made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he has spoken by all of his servants, the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. That is a summation of this unfortunate period of time in Israel's history. Brian, you want to make a comment on that before we talk about hope?
Under Solomon, the United Kingdom reached its pinnacle of power and richness, expanded all the way to the Euphrates and down to Egypt. But when God divided the kingdom, Israel in the north and Judah to the south began their downward spiral. And ultimately, when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, Judah became a vassal state of another nation from that point forward, except for perhaps the Maccabean period, the intertestamental period.
Yep. And we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. Yeah, it's a good observation. The degradation of this heyday, if you will, during the United Kingdom period, obviously. So here's, it's kind of doom and gloom, guys. Doom and gloom. However, in spite of all this evil, in spite of all this sin, there are some slivers of hope here. Now, again, most of it, I would argue, Rick's going to talk about next week in the Southern Kingdom, Brian, as you alluded to a certain degree. However, with the study today, I would offer a couple areas of hope. Elijah and Elisha are being one of them. This kind of goes along with Daniel's lesson this morning as well, pretty nicely. I'm in Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4. Last book of the Old Testament. We see another messianic promise being made. Malachi 4 verse 5 says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction." I'm going to suggest to you guys that Elijah did come. He came in two ways. He came both in a literal sense, and he came in a figurative sense. This is about the messianic hope here. How did Elijah come? Not to agree with mine, but how did he come in a literal sense again? Where do we see Elijah again? You gotta remember? Well, we don't see him. He's not John the Baptist. Your point's right, Dustin. We're going to get there in just a second. Where do we see him, though? Like, he is visible. The Transfiguration. Elijah was present along with Moses. So Elijah was visible again at this event with Jesus. So he was there from a literal perspective. And then from a figurative perspective, Dustin, how was he? John the Baptist. Specifically what Daniel talked about this morning. In talking about the birth of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 1, says, "And he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord, a people prepared. We don't have to take time to read it because I think we're just about out of time. There we are. In Matthew chapter 17, Jesus himself confirmed that Malachi's prophecy had been fulfilled as well. And so, of that, was that the first spell, John? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, perfect. We have plenty of time. So in that sense, yes, John the Baptist was obviously present from from that perspective as well. So in spite of all this degradation, this not a lot of good stuff going on in the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom anyway, God remains faithful to the covenant through the southern kingdom specifically. But also we see this hope of the role of Elijah, Elisha, what they did for the people in trying to bring people to God. What we have seen, is the northern leadership tried to separate God and the people. I mean, that's literally what happened. A separation. Instead of causing people and God to become closer together, which I would argue is probably one of the roles of the leadership, they did the complete opposite. They forced the people and God to get further and further away. That thereby the prophets then were sent to kind of restore this commune, if you will, to a certain degree. Any thoughts about that before we, since we have a couple minutes before we close out? Sure. Yep. Well, Elijah in 1 Kings 18 says, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions?" I mean, yes, he was talking to Ahab and Jezebel, but he was really talking to the people. That the people, you need to make a decision on who you're going to serve. Similar to Moses, similar to Joshua, it's a common call of God's leaders to bring people together to choose today whom you're going to serve. And so, absolutely right. Just because, and think about that for us, if we're ever in maybe a poor leadership capacity, is that excuse our own individual actions or responsibilities? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Us alone will stand before God and give an answer to the things that we have done, whether good or bad. So yeah, that's a good, keep us grounded. Michael.
Spoken before the end of this, end of the northern kingdom, and there's messages of hope within his prophecy. One that comes to mind is the picture painted in Isaiah 2 with the mountain of the house of the Lord.
Yeah.
And so, there's some hope in those prophecies.
Exactly. Nope, that's a good reference. Good reference point as well. Anything else anybody wants to add? John.
Thank you. No, I think back to David and Bathsheba and how one of the main punishments was the sword shall never part from his house, his family. And we know that the bloodline was preserved all the way to Christ. God could have preserved that dynasty, as you put it. It was actually a dynasty, if he wanted to, for the whole United Kingdom. But one decision fractured a country. There were subsequent things that you rightfully addressed. And I just think about the choices we make have lasting consequences. And what we can do with God if we're on, to the point from last Sunday, if we choose to be on God's side, God doesn't choose to be on our side. We have to choose to be on God's side. If we do that, those lasting decisions can go the other way too.
Totally agree. It's Mike's got something in. The Monday morning quarterback. It's easy to read back and say, okay, well, here's why this happened. And I think to your point is 100% accurate. But these decisions do bring about a broader narrative. And yes, there were some big decisions that are made. Jeroboam's setting up two false calves, one at Bethel, one at Dan. I think that's a big decision. Yes, there were some individual decisions that kind of further progressed that downward spiral. But to me, maybe the point you're making, John, is big things matter as well. And there are some big decisions that we need to make sure we make, right, to avoid some of these pitfalls. You want to close out, Mike?
Yeah, I was going to say that sometimes we say that God is faithful to his people, But I think you brought up the good point that God is faithful to the covenant, and as long as the people are faithful to the covenant, God is faithful to the people. It's not just that one-way thing. And that's where Israel fell in. They weren't faithful to the covenant, therefore God was not faithful to them.
Yep. Good point. Good point. Okay, well, thank you guys. On that, we'll close. Again, no class on Wednesday night. We'll do the singing, but then we'll jump into the Southern Kingdom next Sunday morning. Thank you.